In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this filet crochet bralette. It's a matching bralette to my filet crochet shorts, but I thought I'd keep them separate in case you wanted to make one and not the other. And yes, that's why I kept them separate. I think a filet crochet bralette is quite a good first filet crochet project because the size of it, like it's a much smaller garment. So it's quite good for just like getting used to filet crochet and not making like a whole top, whole dress, whole skirt. Like it's quite a good introduction, I think. You might think differently. But yeah, this tutorial is going to go through the method, and then all of the grids are available in the ebook. And I've made a few different size grids because I feel like a bralette, you need different sizes. We're all a bit different. So yeah, there's a few different sizes available in the ebook, as well as instructions on how to adapt it to make it bigger and smaller. So yeah, all of that will be linked below, and I'll get into the tutorial. So before we get into it, I'll just explain a filet crochet grid, which is made up of blank and filled in squares to make your design. So I've got this little section of a grid pattern, and I'm going to talk you through it right to left, just so you can fully understand what each grid square means. So for this section, it's a double crochet, chain, 11 more double crochets, chain, and a double crochet. It's just important to remember that every square on the grid counts for 2 stitches. This is sometimes a double crochet and a chain for a blank square, and other times it's 2 double crochets for a filled in square. But you also have to remember that grid squares share walls with each other. So for the section of 5 filled in squares here, the total number of double crochets is 11 because of this shared stitch. It's also worth noting some people decide to do 2 double crochets to fill in each filled square. This just follows the same principles as I've already outlined, but just doubled in number. So also for the blank squares, you'd want to do 2 chains instead of 1 chain in between. This is also a very simple and effective way of adding width to a grid pattern without needing to alter the actual pattern itself. One more thing before we get into the making of this bralette: whenever you run out of a ball of yarn and need to change onto a new one, we're going to do so with a magic knot. To do a magic knot, you take your 2 ends of yarn. With one of the pieces of yarn, you tie a knot around the other piece of yarn, and then you do the same with the other piece of yarn, so you tie a knot with it around your first piece of yarn. You'll now have 2 knots that you can pull together, and then you can either trim the ends or leave them long enough to weave in. For this bralette, I used 2 balls of the Hobbii Rainbow Lace Yarn in royal blue. I'm around a size small/medium on the top, so this is how many I needed, but you may want more or less. I used a 3mm hook when crocheting the underbust band because I doubled up my yarn here, but for the rest of the project I used a 2mm hook. You will also need some elastic and thread to sew this elastic closed into a circle. This elastic should be the length of your underbust or wherever you want the bralette to sit. I would give it a slight stretch as you measure it around yourself, as you want this to cinch in the underbust a bit, but you also don't want it to be too tight. We're going to start by making the underbust elasticated band. As I've already said, I doubled up my yarn here to make the band a bit thicker, but this is totally optional. With the doubled up yarn, I used my 3mm hook instead of the 2mm hook. My starting chain was 11 chains long, as I wanted my rib stitch to be 10 stitches wide, with 1 turning chain. I like to check that the length of my chain is at least double the width of the elastic, which is going to be encased inside it. So you can do this by just doubling it over the elastic and making sure it fits. Once you have your starting chain, single crochet back down the length of it. To do a single crochet, push your hook through, pull some yarn back, yarn over, and pull through the 2 loops on your hook. When you get to the other end of the chain once and turn your work. This row will be a little bit different to the first row, as we're going to begin our rib stitch. For the first and last stitch of every row, I like to do a complete single crochet where I push through both sides of the stitch in the row before, but for every other stitch in the row, we need to work into the back loop only. So we're still doing a single crochet stitch, but only into the back loop to give it the ribbed look. So yeah, as I said, when you reach the last stitch of the row, do a normal complete single crochet and then chain once to turn your work. On your way back down the row, do a normal single crochet into the first stitch again, and then do your single crochet rib stitch the rest of the way down the row until you reach the last stitch, where again you'll be doing a complete single crochet before chaining and turning your work. Repeat this process row after row to give you the ribbed look for the band. Once your band is long enough, we need to slip stitch from the first row into the last row. To slip stitch your first row to the last row, complete your final row of stitching, chain once, and then match your first and last row up together. Then push the hook through the stitch on one side and then through the corresponding stitch on the other side. Pull some yarn back through both the stitches and then through the loop on your hook. Continue this process all the way down the row. When you get to the last stitch, do not secure and cut the yarn. We're now going to insert the elastic. You need to cut and sew your elastic to your desired underbust measurement. I choose to sew it together on my sewing machine, but you can do it by hand, just make sure it's very secure. Place your elastic band over your ribbed band. We're then going to fold the ribbed band over the elastic to encase it. We now want to close the ribbed band with the elastic inside it. Your yarn is already attached to one side of your band from where we attached the sides together. Slip stitch into the other side of the folded ribbed band. We're now going to repeat this process all the way around the band, but instead of slip stitching, we're going to single crochet as it has a bit more stretch to it. You will want to single crochet into every end stitch of ribbing. If you're unsure about the number of stitches to do in the round here, it may be a good idea to count how many rows of ribbing you did and match this number. Once you've single crocheted all the way around the band and encased the elastic inside, slip stitch from your last single crochet stitch into the first single crochet stitch. To give you an idea of stitch count, for my size, I crocheted 150 stitches in the round. We're now going to secure the yarn, so chain, cut the yarn and pull it through to secure a knot. We're now going to start working on the main body of the bralette. I choose to change back to one single piece of yarn and my 2mm crochet hook. I also like to place stitch markers onto the project to mark out where my grid is going to sit. So initially I placed stitch markers every 10 stitches just to help me work out where to place my actual grid markers. My grid that I used was 78 columns wide. I decided I wanted about 40 stitches gap in the back of the bralette. So I attached my yarn 20 stitches away from the back seam, leaving the other 20 stitches on the other side of the back seam. I attached the yarn back onto the project with a slip stitch. I like to do a completely blank row of double crochet mesh stitches before I start my filet grid, as I just find it easier to keep the grid squares correct with actual boxes to work into. So after slip stitching my yarn back onto my project, I chained up 3 times, 2 for the stitch height and 1 for the gap in between the mesh stitches. I then begun my double crochet mesh stitch. Usually with a double crochet mesh stitch, you would skip a stitch before doing your double crochet. However, as I doubled up my yarn for my band and the first row of crochet, this row appears a bit thicker and wider, so I made the call to do my double crochet mesh stitch into every stitch in the row without skipping every other stitch. So as you can see, I'm doing a double crochet and a chain and then double crocheting straight into the next stitch instead of skipping over a stitch. You can totally do your double crochet mesh stitch like usual and skip every other stitch, but this will also bring your stitch count down to be half the size, which will make your bralette fit a lot tighter. Now, I know that my grid pattern is 78 columns wide, but we have 110 blank squares between our stitch markers marking out our panel. So I know that I need 32 of these squares to be blank, so I chose to do 16 blank squares each side of my filet crochet grid. Once you reach the stitch marker that sits 20 stitches away from the back seam at the other side of the bralette, we're going to chain 3 times and turn our work. We're going to be working this bralette in a panel, so at the end of each row, we're going to chain 3 times to turn the work. Again, this is 2 for the height of the stitch and 1 for the gap between the mesh stitches. Now, do your double crochet mesh stitch until you reach the stitch marker marking out the start of your filet grid. Once you reach your stitch marker, start referring to your grid pattern. You can choose to work from either side of the grid first, but make sure to be working bottom up. The first row of filet crochet takes a bit of counting. I started from right to left, so I knew my grid started with 17 blank squares. This was then followed by 9 filled in squares. Remember, each square equals 2 stitches and there is 1 shared stitch. So for these 9 filled in squares, you should be doing 19 double crochet stitches. Now continue following your grid across the row until you reach your other stitch marker. Once you have reached your other stitch marker, you should have now completed the first row of your filet grid. Continue your double crochet mesh stitch until you finish the row and meet your other stitch marker. Chain 3 times and turn your work. Also remember to work from the other end of your filet grid, as we've now turned our work around, and you'll need to do this for every row. Now we're just going to repeat what we did for the first row. Double crochet mesh stitch until you reach your stitch marker, marking out the start of your filet grid. Follow your filet grid until you reach your other stitch marker, and in this row you can start referring to your previous row to start helping you place stitches, although if you find it easier you can just continue counting the squares in the grid. Again, once you reach your other stitch marker, do your double crochet mesh stitch to the end of the row. Repeat these steps until you've completed your grid. I like to finish the top of my bralette with a line of solid double crochet, but I also like to create seamless ties from the back of the bralette, so I kind of combine these steps. Once I reach the end of my final row, I chain 100 times. Once you've got your chain, work back down it with double crochets. You'll then meet the edge of your bralette where you can continue double crocheting along the entire row. Once you reach the other end, do 100 chains again. From the end of this chain, work 100 double crochets back. You want to twist this strap round slightly so that when you reach the bralette again, you're slip stitching from your strap into the bottom of the double crochet at the end of the bralette. This just keeps the row nice and level. Once you've slip stitched from your strap into the bottom of that double crochet stitch, we need to secure the yarn. Chain, cut the yarn and pull it through to secure a knot. We now need to work out where to position our straps. I find it best to try on the bralette and place the stitch markers where I feel the straps would sit best. Once you take the bralette back off, just make sure the stitch markers are evenly spaced. You may need to count from the back of the bralette around just to make sure each one is placed evenly. Once you've decided on your strap placements, we need to attach the yarn back on at one of these stitch markers with a slip stitch. Then we need to chain for the strap. I decided to do 75 chains, but you may want to do more or less depending on the length of strap you want. I would recommend trying the bralette on again with these chains in place and stretching it over your shoulder to check it's the right length. Once your chain is the desired length, slip stitch it to one of the end double crochets of the back of your bralette. Slip stitch 3 stitches along and chain once to turn. Work double crochets back into every chain. Once you reach the front of your bralette again, slip stitch into the stitch 3 stitches away from where you attached your strap. Now we need to secure the yarn, so chain, cut the yarn and pull it through to form a knot. And then you just repeat this step for the other strap. Once your straps are complete, weave in all of your loose ends. You'll probably want to attach a lining for this bralette. I would recommend getting some non-fraying fabric and cutting a rectangle the same size as your panel, maybe a little bit smaller to account for stretch. There are definitely better ways to line your projects, so if you have a better way, then please use that. But I basically just tack it in quite lightly, but also making sure the stitches are secure, and then I kind of leave it at that. And then, with your lining in place, your bralette is done.